Afternoon session is going to begin with a talk by Professor Bruce Nelson, who is a professor of history at Dartmouth College. So he's come from the other coast, or near it, and it's good to have him back on the West Coast, where he has done a significant amount of research on waterfront workers. His book, Workers on the Waterfront, Seamen, Longshoremen, and Unionism in the 1930s, is an excellent chronicle that I know many of you have read of your own part. Not unlike Professor Cherney, he also is using this occasion as sort of a natural historical laboratory with all of this wisdom of the longshore that has congregated here for this weekends of event. And he tells me that he too has brought a tape recorder so that he's using this for his continuing research. He also is at work on a set of research that will yield a book tentatively titled Organized Labor and the Struggle for Black Equality. That focuses on CIO unions. So his talk today is on Harry Bridges, the ILWU, and race relations during the Civil Rights era. Welcome, Professor Nelson.
I live in Vermont, and I called my wife the other morning to check in. I actually went to the ILW archives for a couple of days so I could learn something before I made these comments. And I called my wife, and she told me it was 27 below zero. And she had woken up that morning, and I called her at 20 to 11. Her time was still 8 below zero. So I must tell you, I'm really glad to be here. During the years from the mid-1930s through the late 1940s, the unions affiliated with the Congress of Industrial Organizations emerged as formidable challengers to the conservative, narrowly job-conscious, and often racist unionism of the American Federation of Labor. Given the inclusive character of industrial labor markets, CIO leaders were well aware that they had to organize blacks as well as whites if their unions were to survive. Moreover, unlike the AFL, the early CIO included a substantial number of left-wing activists, mainly communists and socialists, who had a strong commitment to the goal of racial equality. Thus, at its founding convention in 1938, the CIO declared its uncompromising opposition to any form of discrimination, whether political or economic, based on race, color, creed, or nationality. When the CIO launched organizing campaigns in the steel, meatpacking, and automobile industries, its leadership took special pains to reach out to black workers, and often succeeded in winning their allegiance. Historian Nelson Lichtenstein points out that at the giant River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, the process of unionization worked an enormous transformation in the consciousness of black workers. For the next decade at least, the Rouge Foundry, where most black workers were concentrated, became the center of civil rights militancy in the Detroit area. In Chicago, according to historian Elizabeth Cohen, blacks responded with a tremendous enthusiasm to the CIO's organizing drives. Cohen concludes that while the CIO hardly created a racially integrated society, it went further in promoting racial harmony than any other institution in existence at that time. Other scholars, however, have sharply dissented from this optimistic view and have portrayed organized labor, including the CIO, as a vehicle for defending the relatively privileged position of white workers vis-a-vis their minority competitors in the labor market. The best-known advocate of this view is Herbert Hill, who holds a joint appointment in the departments of Afro-American Studies and Industrial Relations at the University of Wisconsin. Hill came to know the trade union movement intimately through his many years of service as NAACP labor secretary, beginning in the late 1940s. And he maintains that the great promise of the CIO, the promise of an interracial labor movement, was never realized. More broadly, Hill argues, the historical record makes it clear, and I'm quoting him now, that with certain limited exceptions, labor unions have functioned to advance the interests of white workers, to guarantee for them privileges in the labor market. How does the history of the ILWU fit within the framework of this argument? Did the leadership of Harry Bridges, his undeniable association with the left, and his union's reputation as left-wing or, quote, communist-dominated, unquote, mean that the ILWU's record was markedly different from that of more conventional CIO unions in regard to race? To answer that question, we have to begin with an assessment of the long-term evolution of race relations on the waterfront. Dock labor, and dock unionism in particular, had its own special pattern with regard to ethnicity and race. On the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, the International Longshoremen's Association had found it necessary to embrace a mosaic of nationality groups, and above all, to find a way of achieving an accommodation between blacks and whites. In some ports, whites predominated. In other ports, the two races divided the work equally. In still others, African Americans constituted the overwhelming majority of the dock labor force. In these circumstances, said scholars Sterling Sparrow and Abram Harris in 1931, the black worker probably plays a more important role in the ILA than he does in any other labor union. The key to this accommodation, however, was not an ideology of interracial unionism, but a narrow pragmatism based upon years of painful experience. We are in the union today because the white man had to take us in for his own protection, said a black ILA official. Outside the organization, the Negro could scab on the white man. Inside, he can't. On the West Coast, before the big strike of 1934 and the founding of the ILWU, the pattern had been dramatically different. Here, the black population was much smaller than in the Atlantic and Gulf ports, and dock workers and their unions had succeeded in excluding African Americans altogether, or nearly so. Insofar as black workers found a place on the West Coast waterfront before 1934, it was mainly as strikebreakers, and then, for the most part, only temporarily. According to census data, African Americans constituted 1.4% of the dock labor force in California in 1930, and an even smaller percentage in the Pacific Northwest. Economist Herbert Northrop reported that on the eve of the 1934 strike, there were only 23 black ILA members on the entire West Coast. From the standpoint of official union policy, this situation would change dramatically during and after the big strike, as Professor Cherney already indicated this morning. And it would change mainly because of the growing influence of Harry Bridges and the left. Bridges and other strike leaders welcomed blacks into the San Francisco Longshore Local, and immediately after the strike, Bridges announced that black workers would never again find the doors to the San Francisco Local closed. With the formation of the ILWU in 1937, San Francisco's Local 10 quickly distinguished itself as a haven of racial equality. Summing up its own history in 1955, the union declared proudly, and I'm quoting, "The ILWU banned racial discrimination and segregation 20 years before the United States Supreme Court had the courage to do so." A reference, of course, to the Brown decision of 1954. Although this statement may be an accurate indicator of Bridges and the international leadership's intent, as a summation of the union's history, I believe it obscures more than it reveals. There is no denying that Bridges himself had a strong commitment to the principle of racial equality. Not only did he push the San Francisco Local toward a practical commitment, a practical stance that reflected this principle, but he did so in the face of considerable resistance from some elements of the white rank and file. Cleophas Williams, a black longshoreman and member of Local 10, recalled such a moment in 1945, when the end of World War II meant that the ILWU was faced with reducing the size of a labor force, or with the possibility of reducing the size of a labor force that for the first time included significant numbers of African Americans. At a union meeting in San Francisco, according to Williams, a white worker asked Bridges how he proposed to deal with the, quote, excessive numbers, unquote, of blacks on the waterfront. And Bridges, according to Williams, replied that if work ever slowed to the point where only 2 workers remained on the docks, he personally believed that one of them should be black. Williams remembered Bridges' remark as, quote, very shocking to me, because there was no political gain for him by making this statement. There was no gain even among blacks at that particular time, because many of the blacks were still on probation, so they couldn't vote. Williams concluded, I had been exposed to some of the left-wing forces, but I had never heard anyone put his neck on the chopping block by making a public statement of this kind. Bridges, of course, was an Australian immigrant who lived and worked mainly among whites in a society that during his formative years as a labor leader was still permeated by white supremacist assumptions and practices. In explaining his clear and courageous dissent from the society's prevailing racial mores, one must begin by pointing to the tenacity of his personal qualities, by pointing to the tenacity of his commitment to principle and to the force of his personality. But in explaining Bridges' dissent from the society's prevailing racial mores, I am inclined to believe that one must look beyond his personal qualities, however admirable and strong, to the influence of the left and the Communist Party in particular. Whatever else one can and must say in criticism of the Communist Party, it's important to acknowledge that it was almost unique among predominantly white organizations in its close identification with the struggle for black equality. And I could spend quite a bit of time elaborating on that, but I won't. I don't have time. But Bridges and the communist commitment to racial equality was not by itself sufficient to shape the practice of the ILWU's white rank and file, including the famed generation of the 1930s. There can be no doubt that the courage and militancy of rank and file dock workers was one of the keys to the victory they won in the big strike of 1934. Moreover, friend and foe alike agreed that in the aftermath of the strike, rank and file longshoremen won an extraordinary degree of control of the work process. So much, this work process, not word process. So much so that one employer spokesman complained the union stewards established the manner in which and the speed at which work is to be performed on the waterfronts of the Pacific coast. I think that has a wonderful ring to it even to this day. While no doubt regarding this complaint as an overstatement, the union was also happy to emphasize the remarkable changes that had occurred at the point of production. Today, said a union pamphlet published as early as 1935, longshoremen do not have to fawn or lick anyone's boots to get a job. They can afford the luxury of being men, capital M, capital E, capital N. An expert witness readily agreed with this assessment. Corpus Christi longshoreman Gilbert Mers took a walking tour of the San Francisco waterfront in 1937, and he later recalled, quote, "These San Francisco guys work the way that men ought to work. There was none of the shouting and cursing and the driving so prevalent on the Gulf. I found myself thinking in that cool San Francisco temperature and at that sensible work pace, a man ought to last until age 80. Maybe we ought to say a man ought to be able to last until age 80. Fortunately, there were pensions. One of the most remarkable characteristics of the West Coast longshoremen was their willingness to extend their militancy from the realm of pork chops to the realm of politics. To be sure, there was plenty of job-related militancy among industrial workers in the 1930s, highlighted by the sit-down strikes that helped spearhead the organization of the auto and rubber industries in Flint, Detroit, and Akron. But the West Coast maritime workers, and first and foremost the longshoremen, were practically unique among American workers in their willingness to protest, even strike, over political issues, such as the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, Japanese aggression against China, and closer to home, the killing of a dock worker by a San Pedro policeman. After the fatal shooting of longshoreman Norman Gregg in May 1937, maritime workers and other unionists shut down the entire port of San Pedro. Gotta get the lingo. Every dock, every store, and every streetcar claimed the voice of the Federation. San Francisco longshoreman Henry Shrimps declared that the goal of the maritime workers was not just to win better wages and conditions for themselves, but to, quote, generally advance the human cause. Shrimp, who was closely identified with the left at the time, may not have spoken for all of his fellow workers, but his statement conveys an essential ingredient of the spirit and the vision that animated many West Coast longshoremen during the turbulent 30s. Now, I want to sum up by talking about principles in conflict, because it seems to me there are three, or possibly more, but at least three principles that the leadership of the ILWU and the union, by and large, had a very strong commitment to. One of them, of course, was racial equality. And from the standpoint of the leadership, I don't think there was any doubt that that commitment was real and thoroughgoing and consistent. But the union was also committed to seniority and to autonomy. And oftentimes, the achievement of racial equality, and certainly the achievement of a racially inclusive union, was in conflict in practice with the ways in which seniority and autonomy were implemented. I should point out that the ILWU had a very special and important reason for, as you well know, for taking a consistent and principled stand in relationship to the issue of autonomy. The ILWU defended itself from those who expelled it from the CIO in 1949 and 50 on the grounds that as an autonomous union, it had the right to make autonomous decisions in regard to issues, many issues, including issues such as the Marshall Plan, the Henry Wallace presidency of 1948, and many other political issues. The CIO refused to accept the union's right to autonomy and expelled it from the CIO. And so the ILWU had a very strong reason to respect not only the issue of autonomy in general, but the issue of autonomy among its local unions. And I'll just close by saying that it seems to me that there's, in relationship to the issue of race within the ILWU, within the labor movement generally, and in large measure within American society, there's both an irony and a tragedy here. The irony, of course, is that, as has been so eloquently pointed out by others, the ILWU achieved a great deal for its membership. It turned dock workers into the lords of the docks, as they call themselves. It turned them into men with economic security, with pride in their work, although I'm sure they always had a measure of that. Men with good wages, conditions, and benefits that were the envy of large numbers of other workers who then sought to be included in this union to achieve access to those very conditions. And the issue of access became most compelling at a moment in American history, that is the 60s, where two things are happening in American society at the same time, right? One is there's a civil rights revolution, which is making the issue of racial inclusion and racial equality more compelling than it had ever been before in American society. But at the same time, it was also leading to a tremendous migration of blacks out of the rural South into the urban North, where they needed jobs, and where they looked to a union like the ILWU to be included precisely because of what the union offered, both in terms of its racial record, and even more so probably, its economic record. And yet, as you know far better than I, that came about at a time when the numbers of jobs, not only on the waterfront, for many reasons, including the M&M agreement, but for many reasons, but also jobs in many industries were being eliminated as the United States was beginning to go through a process of economic restructuring, which we are still feeling the effects of today. And so one cannot ask the ILWU or any other union or group of people to bear a disproportionate share of the responsibility to be inclusive. The record in many respects is a good one, but it also seems to me the record is a complex one, and it's upon the grounds of complexity and reality that we have to build our future. Thank you.